And we are very grateful for our field sponsor for this webinar. Our sponsor is Delight Gardeling. And thank you very much, Delight, for sponsoring this. If anybody is interested in sponsoring one of our From the Field webinars, please contact Kate Fitzwilliams at the number or the address below. So I think that's our last slide. So over to George. George Archibald, of course, is the co-founder of the International Crane Foundation, has tremendous experience throughout the world. And a lot of that relates to work with traditional communities in the various places that cranes are found throughout the world. Today, he's going to talk about the traditional communities and the welfare of cranes in Iran, Bhutan, Tibet, Turkey, and Russia. So that's quite the tour around Asia. So take it away, George.
Oh, thank you very much, Spike. And hello, everybody. It's lovely to be with you on this beautiful spring day in Baraboo. It's likely the evening in China, and it's the winter down in Southern Africa. But welcome to my webinar. There are 15 species of cranes in the world, and Asia has the greatest number. The number of cranes per continent is proportional to the size of the continent. And Asia is the largest continent. It has the most cranes. We don't know why cranes never got to South America, but there are no reports of them down there. But today I'm going to concentrate on several species of cranes in Asia. First, I'm going to talk about the black-necked crane of the Tibetan Plateau, then about the Siberian crane that covers many, many countries, both in East Asia and West Asia. Then I'm going to talk about a population of Eurasian cranes right here in Turkey, over here. So we'll begin by talking about the black-necked crane. And this was the last species of crane to be described by science, by Colonel Przewalski, a Russian explorer in the late 1800s. And they're found exclusively on the Tibetan Plateau of Western China. China has more species of cranes than any other country in the world. And the lion's share of the black-necked cranes are on the Tibetan Plateau of China, but there's a small population in Ladakh, India, and they winter, some winter in Bhutan, on the southern slopes of the Himalayas, and in Arunachal Pradesh of India. But today we're going to be talking mainly about Tibet, which is a western region of China. And these cranes are nesting, believe it or not, sometimes at over 16,000 feet above sea level, on wetlands that are not frozen for a couple of months in the summer. The breeding season is very short. There's rainfall, the monsoons that come to Southern Asia spill over onto the Tibetan Plateau, but there's also water from the melting of glaciers. And the wetlands are open, but many of them are perched on permafrost, permanent ice under these wetlands. And one of the big changes that's happening in the world today, the glaciers are melting very rapidly and the permafrost is melting. And this is having a big effect on the crane populations. Currently, they're increasing because there's more water as the glacial water pours down into these valleys. But ultimately, the black-necked cranes may decrease. There is a totally wonderful culture on the Tibetan Plateau. The people live as nomads out in these very, very stark landscapes, and they depend on their herds of domestic animals, which are grazers, sheep, goats, and yaks. And their houses are made out of the products, and their food comes from these animals. They live in harmony with nature, and they protect the black-necked crane as a sacred bird. And I've often wondered what's so special about the black-necked cranes from their point of view. So I asked my friend, this herder, one day through an interpreter, why the black-necked cranes were so special. There are other beautiful birds on the Tibetan plateau, such as the bar-headed geese, the citrine wagtail, the ruddy shelducks, the Pallas fish eagle, fabulous birds, and there's also the black-necked crane. He looked at me in surprise, wondering why I'd asked such a question. And he said, the black-necked cranes are protected because they're sacred. And that was the end of the conversation. I think they're sacred because they do things that are endearing to humans. They're huge birds. They stand almost as high as a teenager, say. They're monogamous. They pair and come back to their territories every spring, and they shower attention on their fast-growing chicks. The family is very important, and of course, in human cultures, our family is extremely important to us as well. So we have that in common with cranes. And they come with the seasons. In autumn, they migrate to lower altitudes, and in spring, they return to the higher altitude. And the Tibetan people welcome the arrival of the cranes in their areas. They love to have them on the landscape. This is a wintering area in Tibet. There are houses, of course, and huge fields of barley. These people are not depending so much on their herds as on growing crops. It's very, very different than up at the high altitudes where it's too cold to grow anything. And the black-necked cranes feed in the fields on the waste grain and are protected by the local people as sacred birds. About 600 black-necked cranes fly over the Himalayas into the little kingdom of Bhutan, which is sandwiched on the east slope of the Himalayas between China and India. And on November 7th, the birthday of the fourth king of Bhutan, a huge crane festival takes place at a temple in the Popshika Valley to celebrate the black-necked cranes. And thousands of people come in for this festival. The children dress as cranes and do dances, etc. But throughout the winter months, the Bhutanese and the Tibetans enjoy the cranes on their landscape. Then spring comes, and on a special day when the cranes start circling the skies to move on to their breeding grounds at higher altitudes, the local people make fires using juniper branches to make a lot of smoke at their little shrines, because they believe that the cranes circling the fields blesses their land, which is sacred to them too, because they depend on the land, of course, for their food. So on that special day, each family has a ceremony out at the field where they're about to plant their barley. And this lady is carrying a small shrine. People are very, very dedicated Buddhists. They dress up their yaks for this ceremony. And here's a man and his wife with their yak. And they even give the yaks some wine to drink before they start plowing their field. And as they plow, the grandmother's coming behind and she's putting grain into the furrow that's being plowed by the yaks. It's a beautiful ceremony, and it's all connected to the departure of the black-necked cranes blessing their fields. So the cranes are strictly protected by the Tibetan people. When I was up there doing research, if I would stop my car to count the cranes, they were worried that I might be there to harm them. So they would run out and chase the cranes, so they flew away. I'd have to explain to them, no, I'm here to help the cranes, not to harm them. But it shows the devotion that the people have towards cranes. And the black-necked cranes are increasing. They've increased from about 10,000 to 15,000 in recent years. perhaps because the counting is better, perhaps because there's more water as the glaciers are melting. But we're concerned with the disappearance of the glaciers and a lot of the permafrost, what's going to happen to the black-necked cranes down the road. I'm going to talk mostly today about the Siberian crane, a crane that I have been working on and that Ron Flowey, the other co-founder of the Crane Foundation, did his PhD on. We have been very involved in this beautiful white crane that's very, very different from other cranes because they have a flute-like voice. They have the longest beak of any crane. In captivity, they're among the most aggressive of cranes. They have very strong personalities, and they have very long and complicated migrations. When we started the Crane Foundation, there were 3 wintering areas of the Siberian crane, one in Iran, one in India, and one in China. And the breeding areas are in the far north of Russia. So this morning, I'm going to talk about several of these areas and how the local people revere the Siberian crane. The Siberian crane is pure white. It's a white that is whiter than pelicans and egrets. When they stand among other white birds, they actually shine. More light is reflected from their plumage. Perhaps this is an adaptation to very dense plumage because they breed in such cold areas. And when you see a flock of Siberian cranes in the sky, it's a spiritual experience. It's poetry in motion. Not only the sight of these magnificent birds, but their calls. They have a flute-like call, doot, 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 in contrast to the rougher call of other species of cranes, which sound something like this, brah, 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 very broken. But the Siberian crane's call is very musical. And when a mated pair do their unison call, it sounds like this. Doo, 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 as they put their beak up and down, and the low note is the male and the high note is the female. Before they mate in the breeding season, they paint the base of their neck with mud. It can be washed off, but this is part of their mating ritual. And they lavish care on their fast-growing chicks. In the winter, the chick stays with their parents and depends on receiving food from their parents until that long beak of the chick completes its growth in February or March. We can easily count the number of juveniles in the flock because they are a different color. They're brown. This helps camouflage them before they can fly up in the tundra where there are many predators. Well, first of all, I'm going to speak about where they winter in China. This was unknown. We had done a lot of research on the wintering grounds in India and in Iran, but China was a mystery until 1981 when it was found, when they located the cranes at Poyang Lake. These were colleagues from the Chinese Academy of Sciences in Beijing. And back in the early 1980s, the local people were actually shooting cranes and other birds with cannons out at Poyang Lake. There were great numbers of birds gathered there and selling them. Well, soon the government protected the area as a nature reserve. This is back in the early 1980s. So many changes in China over these decades that we've seen. Back then, people were on bicycles, but signs up for the Siberian crane. The shooting of the Siberian crane was stopped. The bird was protected throughout the country. A lot of research was done in their habitats. And that population of Siberian cranes has increased. Perhaps there were 1,000, maybe a few more when they were first discovered, but now there are more than 5,000 birds. It's a wonderful conservation story, and our congratulations to our colleagues in China and in Russia. They have this long migration route, thousands of miles in a very, very narrow corridor, all the way back up to the tundra of Russia. And up there, the tribal people living out on the tundra are reindeer herders. They have huge herds of reindeer and depend on that animal. Well, they have long winters and they can travel in their sleds with the reindeers, but in the spring it looks like this. Everything melts, the snow is gone, wetlands are everywhere out in the tundra, and the Siberian cranes arrive back from China to breed. Now, here's a festival up in that region of Yakutia. That's the Republic of Russia, called Yakutia. These are Yakutian people, and they revere the Siberian crane just like the Tibetans do. And here they are at a summer festival. They're dressed as Siberian cranes, and they're doing the dance. One of my colleagues told me that some people believe if they are ill and if they're taken out and they can see a wild Siberian crane, they will be healed. A school teacher told me that she believed that if you see a Siberian crane, you'll be happy for the rest of your life. So there are a lot of these stories connected through their love of the Siberian cranes up in this area of Yakutia. But I was fortunate to visit the breeding ground of the flock that winters in India, in Western Siberia. These people are called the Khanty people, Khanty, and they also have big herds of reindeer. There are only a few Khanty people left. Most of them have been incorporated into modern Russian society, but these small groups still live in teepees out in the wilderness with their reindeer. There are huge numbers of mosquitoes. That's why they have this smoke coming into their teepees to keep down the mosquitoes. They just live off the land. They make their own boats. They make their sleds that the reindeer haul around. Of course, they're much more mobile in the winter. And they have to protect their food from bears. There are huge grizzly bears there. So they'll build these elevated containers to protect their food from the bears. When they pass away, they make a simple grave because the ground is frozen. They can't dig into it. They'll have some of their cooking utensils, one of their sleds. And there's a great fear of these huge grizzly-like bears, Russian brown bears in the area. So the Khanty people kill these bears, and to drive away the spirit of the bear, they have this costume that is white, and they have a wooden puppet with a string on the beak, and they can open and close the beak, and they make a campfire, and they dress up as Siberian cranes, and they dance around the campfire to drive away the spirit of the bear. They love the Siberian cranes, and they absolutely protect the habitat for the birds. And that region, that whole region along the Kunavat River in Western Siberia is protected, both for the cranes and for the local people that revere the cranes. Those cranes migrated down to India. And when Ramsawi began his research in India back in the 1970s, there were about 75 cranes. The bird sanctuary is not far from the Taj Mahal at a place called Bharatpur. And thousands of people would come there in the winter to see this bird that they called the lily of birds. They're a beautiful white bird, and with their beautiful calls and easily seen. They're quite tame in India because they're so strictly protected. But unfortunately, they are hunted. Cranes are hunted in some areas of Pakistan and in Afghanistan. and in some other areas of Russia and Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan, perhaps. Anyway, we lost the flock of Siberian cranes that comes to India. We could count them every winter, and every winter there were fewer. They always would have some juveniles with them, so they were continuing to breed. But the hunting pressure was so great that we lost the flock of Siberian cranes. And this decline happened more rapidly during the 1980s and 90s, when there were such instabilities in Afghanistan in particular, and a lot of warfare in that region. So this is a photograph of the last Siberian crane that came to India. So this is a great tragedy for the Hunty people. They've lost their cranes. The Indians feel very sad that they can no longer see the Siberian crane. And so no birds in this migration route at all. The other flock of Siberian cranes went to Iran. And this is northern Iran, a lowland area beside the Caspian Sea. And you'll see forests surrounding these rice fields in the middle. And this is called a damgah, a special area for trapping ducks and geese in the winter. The local people build these long walls made out of woven straw to block people from coming into this area that's surrounded by trees. And they want to attract as many waterfowl as possible to this central area of the damgah to facilitate trapping these birds. This is the pathway through the rice fields into the trapping area. And each trapper will have a very limited area. One trapper may have this much of the forest, another trapper will be here. There'll be poles with nets suspended to trap birds that are flying in and out. Here they are. It takes a great deal of work to set up the damgah before the arrival of the birds, creating these visual barriers so that the people will be hiding behind these walls of woven straw. And hunters are back here, and here are all the ducks and geese, thousands and thousands of them. And this is where the Siberian cranes wintered. Fortunately, the hunters protected the Siberian cranes. I just want to explain an ingenious way they have of catching the birds. They make a channel in which they can drive a small flock of mallard ducks, which are semi-domesticated. They want to fly back to a little pond among the trees, and the hunters will actually toss these ducks up into a flock of wild ducks, and the domestic ducks will lead the wild ducks back into a little pond where they're trapped. They also have suspended nets around the area. There's a subculture. These people, these trappers, really enjoy getting out in their little shacks, setting up their traps, and then catching these ducks and bringing them to the market, where they arrange them and sell them fresh meat to the local people. And this is a tradition that has been going on for many, many centuries. Unfortunately, it's being discontinued and being replaced by shooting with guns. Well, fortunately, other people could not visit these damgahs because the local people were afraid that it would scare the waterfowl. And even researchers were not allowed into this whole area until 1978, when Ali Ashtiani, an Iranian scientist, was able to gain permission to take a peek, and he found the Siberian cranes. Since then, conservationists have been working with the damgah managers to help the Siberian cranes. But after the Soviet Union fell apart, there was widespread food shortages along the migration route of the Siberian crane. There was more hunting. And this is the last family of Siberian cranes to come to Iran with a juvenile. This is back in 2005. And today, since 2010, only a single Siberian crane continues to come to this area. And it's announced in the newspapers that Omid, which means hope in Persian language, has come back to that region. My Russian colleagues were able to send a female Siberian crane on 2 occasions to pair with Omid. They paired up and they migrated together, but the females never returned. We don't know why, we don't know what happened to them. My guess is that their wing muscles were not strong enough for that long and arduous migration across the continent to the breeding grounds. We're hoping to try again this fall through cooperation with our colleagues in Belgium, but let's see what happens. This is a beautiful forest at the Damga, and it's one of the few areas where the original forest is conserved on the Caspian lowland. These forests once supported a unique subspecies of the Siberian tiger, but today there are just small areas protected. So, although the local people in Iran and in Russia and love these cranes, we have lost the 2 populations. And one of the dreams in my life is to be able to help with the restoration of the Siberian crane. But first we need peace in that part of the world. Well, next we'll speak about a type of crane that's found in Turkey. This is the Eurasian crane. It's a species that's ecologically very similar to the sandhill crane here in North America. They're found over a huge area of Asia as a breeding bird. And they're wintering all the way from Spain and Morocco and Algeria. A lot of them come down into Ethiopia. In India, huge numbers, and in China. So a huge range. Grus is its name. It was first described, of course, by Linnaeus in Sweden. And recently, a Russian ornithologist, Valentin Ilyashenko, discovered that the cranes in this region, called the Transcaucasian region, have a unique type of Eurasian crane, a subspecies that they call the Transcaucasian crane. And it's a very rare bird. Now, this is a normal, the common Eurasian crane. You'll notice the top of its head, the comb area is bright red. Well, this is the Transcaucasian crane, and it has a totally black crown on top of its head. And their behavior in the wild is quite different from other Eurasian cranes. These ones migrate thousands of miles. These ones just have an altitudinal migration, much like the black-necked cranes on the Tibetan Plateau. Well, they're found in 4 different countries. They're found in Georgia, maybe 15 or 20 pairs. They're found in Armenia, just 1 pair. In Iran, maybe 1 or 2 pairs. And in a high altitude area of central Turkey, we have a population perhaps of 20 pairs. And Freddy Akarsu, a Turkish ornithologist, have been studying these birds since they were first described by Valentin Ilyashenko about 15 years ago. Well, this is the high altitude breeding habitat. And in this part of Turkey, there's a unique population of humans called the Alevi. The Alevi traditionally were migratory, much like the cranes, going to high altitude areas in the winter where there's better grazing and coming down into the valleys to grow crops in the summer. Well, their lifestyle has changed somewhat. They've become much more sedentary in recent years. This shows where the Alevi people live, and this is the area where most of the Transcaucasian Eurasian cranes live in Turkey. I'll just go back here. Well, because these people traditionally were migratory, it was difficult for them to build permanent residence. They would change the feeding areas of their flocks and so on. And normally, these Islamic people would build mosques, but these people couldn't. So they had very special ceremonies in their tents, including musical instruments and dances that mimic the movements of the cranes, because they too admired the cranes that shared their same habitat with them. And the conservation program in Turkey is being helped because of these traditional values of the Alevi people. Here's a flock of cranes flying over one of their villages in the highlands of central Turkey. And another view of one of the wetlands where they breed. Well, one of the things we found out over the years in working with cranes is that traditional societies like the Hante people or like the Alevi people protect biodiversity. And when modernization comes, particularly high-level industrialized agriculture, we have a decline in biodiversity and of course a decline in our cranes. And very briefly, I'm going to explain about this connection between traditional cultures and conservation in other areas of the world. This painting was done by the Chippewa chiefs in northern Wisconsin back in 1849. They did this painting to take to the President of the United States to say that we, the clans in northern Wisconsin, represented by the tokens of different animals, the leader of which is the Crane clan. We are connected in our minds and we are connected in our hearts for the love of these great wilderness areas where we live. And we would propose that this area be saved for our people. The special bird was the sandhill crane in this case. And in many of the tribes of Native Americans and First Nation people in Canada, the crane has a special place in their culture. Over in Ethiopia, here are local people and here are wattled cranes. In Ethiopia, all birds are protected. It's a taboo to hurt birds. And you have huge populations of humans living off the land, and we still have the cranes in that area. So it shows, even if life is very simple and traditional, cranes and local people can live together quite peacefully. The flag of Uganda is a crowned crane. And in Asia, the beautiful cranes of Japan and Russia and China and Korea, the red-crowned cranes, are symbols of long life and good luck and have special protection, special value to the people in that region. Here in North America, our whooping crane is the rarest of all the cranes in the world. There are only about 500 left in the wild in the flock that migrates from northern Canada to Texas, but they were reduced to just 15 birds back in 1941. And it was because during those 1800s, when people poured into the prairies to develop farmland, they lived off the land and a big bird was the big meal, and they wiped out the whooping crane. Fortunately, since around the 1930s, efforts have been made to save this beautiful whooping crane, and their numbers have slowly increased. Today we have two experimental flocks, a new flock here in Wisconsin, about 75 birds that migrates down to the southeast. And we have a flock in Louisiana, about the same number, that are non-migratory. There used to be a non-migratory flock there. But one of the great problems we have is the shooting of whooping cranes today, but mainly by vandals. They are unaware of the rarity of the birds. So the Crane Foundation and our colleagues in various states are working to educate the people in this modern day that the whooping crane is a bird to be protected. Well, hunting of cranes still happens. Sandhill cranes are legally hunted in some of the states and provinces of this country. This is out in Western Texas. And cranes, of course, in China were shot up until the 1980s. Now the hunting is completely banned in China. But in the Middle East, we still have a lot of problems with the shooting of cranes. We have found that hunters are leaders in conservation. And in areas where hunting is legal, conservationists crane conservationists are working with the hunters to educate them about the cranes. And we have found in one area of Texas where whooping cranes are now wintering, the duck hunters in that area famous for duck hunting take special care of the whooping cranes. So hunters in North America are leaders in conservation in many cases. So it's a very, very complicated issue as crane populations increase. Another big challenge we have is crop damage. This is Wisconsin, where corn is damaged, and in East Africa, we have a lot of crop damage with crowned cranes, especially on their corn. But ICF has developed a substance called Avipel that can be applied to the seed before it is planted, and that discourages the birds from eating it. So in conservation, we have to think about the needs of the local people and their survival, as well as the needs of the cranes. And we have some good stories, like in India and Ethiopia, where birds are protected. You can have this harmony between birds and people. And that is something that we hope at ICF to promote around the world where there are problems for cranes. And education, working at the grassroots level with the local people and understanding their needs and helping the local people and telling them about why we are so interested in cranes, the joy that we have from experiencing these birds is quite contagious. And we are hoping in the future that the different cranes and humans can live in harmony in many parts of the world. Thank you. That's the end of my presentation.
Wow, thanks a lot, George. That was really fascinating. We have a few questions, but first I'd like to ask a question. Why do you think that traditional communities identify so much with cranes as opposed to, let's say, herons or egrets or other birds? Is it because they live around those communities? Is it because of their beauty? Why do you think that they identify so much with cranes?
I think it because their size and their beauty, but also they're very vocal. Herons are very silent. Pelicans are very silent. Of course, geese are noisy and so on, but cranes are particularly vocal, and they get your attention. And also, cranes have a sort of Some birds seem to be sort of on remote control. They're doing the same thing. Cranes seem to be investigating things. They're sort of inquisitive and responsive. So they have this quality that makes them very, very interesting. More interesting than some other groups of birds by a lot of people.
Yeah, I agree. Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, George. Another question about the Transcaucasian crane, the one that's based in Turkey. You mentioned that the communities there migrate. Do the birds migrate, or are they sedentary in that region?
Oh, they do migrate. It's very cold there in the winter, and they migrate to lower altitudes in Turkey. But unlike other Eurasian cranes that fly over Turkey to migrate as far south as Ethiopia, these birds do not go much beyond the boundary of Turkey. We have a few reports of one going into Iraq, one going into Syria, but most of them are at low altitude wetlands in Turkey, much like the black-necked cranes do from high altitude to low altitude seasonally.
Okay, thanks for that. Okay, so here are some questions from the Q&A. This is a question from Scott from Michigan, a Crane Clan tribal descendant, who's asking what methods have been successful around the world to reduce and prevent the hunting of cranes beyond just laws banning hunting.
Actually, hunting of sandhill cranes is legal in many states and provinces, but it's very carefully controlled. There are bag limits, and you need to buy a license, and you only can hunt in certain areas. And if whooping cranes are in that area, the hunting is closed. In other states, there have been efforts to start hunting, but there's been a backlash by the local people, and the issue has been dropped. And that has happened in northern Colorado, and more recently here in Wisconsin, and also in Nebraska. So there's quite a variation in the responses of the cranes to hunting. In other parts of the world, cranes will, in some countries, it will be illegal to shoot cranes on paper, but the law is not enforced. And in other areas, there is no legal protection. And it's the leaders, the people with money and cars, they like to go out to these areas, particularly in Saudi Arabia and in Lebanon, and they'll have a big shoot and just kill as many cranes as they can as the birds migrate across their country between breeding grounds in Russia, say, and wintering grounds in Africa. And sometimes in Afghanistan, for example, they'll take a huge sheet of plastic and put lights under it at night so that it looks like the shimmering water, and cranes that are migrating at night might fly down and they will shoot them. So in those areas of the world, we really have to do a great deal of education, and hopefully things will turn around in the future. We have a lot of work.
You mentioned, George, that the Siberian cranes of that Western population, now there's just the one bird left in Iran. And you mentioned you are excited to try to sort of revive that. But it seems like the hunting situation there may still be quite difficult. In that case, you know, is it realistic to try to reintroduce cranes in an area where the dangers are not really changed?
Well, in the Damgah, the cranes are safe, but outside the Damgah, there's hunting all over the place. And the reason the population was so small, it was 12 to 15 birds, is perhaps because the cranes are territorial, and the Damgah, the only 3 surviving Damgahs in the country, could only support a few pairs of wintering cranes. Now we're reduced to 1 bird, and he comes back every year. but he is sort of a representative of Hope. That's his name, Hope. For example, if Hope could be given a female and they migrate to Russia and come back with a chick, it would be headline news all over the place. And through that effort, conservation values are affected, and we would hope that Hope brings hope for its species down the road and maybe reintroduction efforts. But it's just going to take massive changes in the public psyche about hunting and the conservation of wildlife. It's easy to be pessimistic about the whole thing, but you work with what you have and you have faith that things may be better.
Yeah, it's a very poignant story. Here is another question from Nancy. How is the effort funded to provide farmers in developing countries to use Avipel to plant in their fields?
Well, so far as I know, Avipel has not been applied in other countries because you have to go through a whole permitting process and there's a cost involved. So that's something that the Crane Foundation is investigating, how we can secure permission and how we can finance that kind of use. So we haven't reached that point yet.
Okay. Barbara asks, I'm very interested in understanding more about the lesser sandhills out in the western regions of North America. I don't know if she's talking about the interaction between traditional communities and lesser sandhills, but she would like to hear a little bit more about that if you have any information.
Yeah, the lesser sandhill is the most distinctive of the 6 subspecies of sandhill cranes if you look at their DNA. And their behavior out west is very, very different from the other subspecies that is found in that area, which is called the greater sandhill crane, the bird that breeds much further south. They come from Russia, about 100,000 of them, from many areas of the tundra in Alaska and Canada. And they winter, the greatest number winters in western Texas and northern Mexico. But on the wintering grounds, they are quite nomadic. They will fly hundreds of miles between different feeding areas, whereas other subspecies of sandhills usually migrate to one area and stay there throughout the winter. So this nomadic behavior of the lesser sandhill crane is very unique and interesting. It likely has to do with the very availability of food in one area and that giving out, because the habitats that they occupy are in rather arid regions. So the availability of food may be quite variable and not consistent, and that's that type of behavior.
While we're in North America, there's a question from Richard which asks, how do you arrange for the whooping crane flock in Louisiana to be non-migratory when most are migratory?
Well, migration in cranes is learned, and research was done with greater sandhill cranes, raising them in captivity, releasing them in Florida to see if they would become migratory. They're a migratory subspecies, and they all became non-migratory. So based on that result, whooping cranes have been released in the south, and just as the sandhill cranes, they had no experience in migration and therefore became non-migratory. Cranes want to breed in the area where they fledge. They have a very strong drive to return to that area. And if they're raised in captivity and released at a very young age in Louisiana, that is their permanent home. That's where they want to breed.
Thanks, George. As a follow-up question from Jim on the Avipel, and does it stop other birds and mammals that are crop predators? And is it registered in the US?
Yes, Evipal has been approved by the EPA and it is used by farmers here in Wisconsin and I believe in Michigan. And we're hoping that it will be used in other areas in the future where there's crop damage. And it's an organic substance that is very distasteful to cranes. And Jeb Barson, who did a lot of research at ICF with Evipal, got onto it when he found out that it was used in golf courses to keep Canada geese from using those areas where they were not welcome guests. So Canada geese found it distasteful when it was applied to the grass and golf courses.
So it does work for other species than cranes.
Yeah.
Barbara asked another question about ecotourism. I think she's particularly concerned about the plight of hope in Iran. I'm wondering if ecotourism, such as has helped the gorillas, for instance, in East Africa, is that really a promising option for helping with the conservation of cranes?
Yeah, in many areas, you don't want people disturbing the cranes, particularly in breeding areas. So, for example, in Louisiana, we keep it a secret where the cranes are breeding. In areas where cranes winter, ecotourism is very important. For example, in Rockport, Texas, boats go out every day from November through March, loaded with tourists to see the whooping cranes, and millions of dollars come into the local communities that do that in the winter, the hotels, the restaurants, and so on. And in Japan, in the winter, thousands of people come to see the red-crowned cranes at feeding stations in Hokkaido, where hundreds of birds can be seen at close range and photographed. So ecotourism is more applicable in the wintering areas of cranes where they're not breeding, where they're not disturbed. And in the case of Hope, the poor little guy wintering in Iran, he's in the middle of the Damgah, and the Damgah managers, those hunters, they don't want visitors. They don't want anybody in there. And we have to, even the researchers have to meet with them and agree not to do this and that so as not to disturb the ducks and geese away from their traps. In other areas of Western Asia where those Siberian cranes used to travel, one of their stopping places was the delta of the Volga River in Russia. And I think people would go there to see them during migration. And in China, some of the staging areas in northern China where they rest during migration, people will come out to see them as well. So there's quite variation in ecotourism, depending on accessibility and the behavior of the birds.
Great, thanks a lot, George. We have actually quite a few interesting questions in the Q&A. We can't get to all of those, I'm afraid, because we've already come to more or less to the end of our time, but we will respond to them. So George or somebody else from ICF will respond to those questions. I'm sure George will, actually. He's very engaged in this. So thank you, everybody, for the questions. Thank you for attending. And don't forget to join us for our next From the Field webinar, which is on Thursday, July the 14th, the same time, Planes, Cranes, and a Watershed, with conservation photographer Michael Forsberg, who's just a fantastic photographer. You really don't want to miss this, this webinar. And many thanks to our sponsors for that webinar, Bet and Richard Frangish. Next slide, George.
Okay.
Okay, so of course, ICF is a independent NGO. and we depend on your support and your friends' support and people that you know. So please, if you are not a member, become a member of ICF. There are a whole lot of great benefits apart from listening to George's webinars. And if you are a member, encourage someone else to become a member. And please consider making a gift or becoming a member. It's really important to us, and we really appreciate all your support for all that we do. And I think that's our last slide, right, George?
That's it.
Okay. So thanks everybody for joining the webinar. There will be the recording. You can watch it again. You can send it to your friends, and we'll answer all the missing questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you all. Thank you, Spike.